Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The invitation inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty has called out to the world's huddled masses for generations, and they have responded. In the 1990s, immigrants came to America in record numbers. They brought with them their aspirations and energies and continued to fuel American growth as new arrivals became new citizens. But the pace and power of immigration presents America with challenges that demand a positive response. How do immigrants most effectively become Americans, enjoying their rights as they fulfill their responsibilities? And what does the changing face of immigration imply for a country that has long depended on this vital source of enterprise and renewal? My guest is Robert Ponichtera, President and Executive Director of Liberty's Promise. Robert Ponichtera, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, George. Pleasure to be here.
It's a delight to have you here. Let's start with history, because this is a subject that's been with America as long as America has been America, Bob Ponichtera. And here's a sense I have, and let me test it with you, that if you look back over American history, you can pretty much get a good sense of who we are just by looking at this phenomena of immigration over time, whether it's the hopeful waves of European immigrants in the 19th century, the 20th century, and to be quite honest, the shameful forced immigration of slaves to this country. Both things, I think, have to be taken into account. But I want to get your sense of what immigration has meant to America as America has become itself over these centuries.
Well, George, I think it's a very important question to answer because there is a certain amount of debate over the role of immigration in our historical past. Just to be very brief, my own background is one of an immigrant. Both grandparents came from Europe. My mother's side was Italian, my father's side was Polish. And I feel as though I'm part and parcel of the American immigrant experience, in that people came here, both sides of my family. My grandparents came here to look for a better life for their families, and they worked in factories. My grandparents both worked in factories in rural Rhode Island. One of my grandfathers worked on a railroad and earned 10 cents a day working the railroad. And they were doing that so that their families would have a better opportunity here.
Right.
And so, well, our generation, because of our grandparents, my parents worked in businesses, and my generation went off to college, and I think that's part of the growth of the immigrant experience, that people over time become part of this country.
I appreciate that, Bob, and I appreciate the way you personalize it, because it is generational, the way that your ancestors would arrive and then become immediately Americans and then progress over time and resulting in our conversation today, so to speak. But I'm sure you'd agree also, Bob, that the country's attitude, if you will, toward these successive waves has varied, to put it mildly, over time. And let me introduce a couple of thoughts here and get your reaction to them. As important as immigration has been, and as I think of it, and as you exemplify to our country, we've had some perhaps less happy responses to it. I'm thinking historically of things like the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, the Chinese Exclusion Act of the late 19th century, and even the Johnson-Reed Act of the early 20th century, and even attitudes today we see that are sometimes not so favorable. How do you assess that kind of, if not ambivalence, at least variation in American responses to the phenomena?
Well, I think that we have to measure it in two ways, George. In the positive way, this is a country of immigrants, and it's a country that fosters and supports an immigrant experience. It says so on the Statue of Liberty. It says so in the way that we act in a lot of ways toward immigrants in most of our daily lives. A very inclusive and a very supporting role. And when one looks at the fact that this country is a country that has taken in more immigrants than any other country, then one has to say, well, we really stand behind what we preach. On the other hand, I think all people, whether they're Americans or not, are human, and there's certain less inspiring characteristics of human nature. And just to reiterate the Chinese Exclusion Act, if you look back at those, at that time, The Chinese were excluded basically because they were different. And it was a process of their having a different culture, of speaking an entirely different language. And if you look at sort of Harper's Illustrated, that, you know, go back and have a look at the political cartoons, you know, no one who was anti-Chinese was anti-immigrant necessarily. They were simply anti-Chinese. And they thought that, well, European immigrants coming in are fine because they have the same cultural background as we do. They have the same religious background, more or less, as we do. But the Chinese, different language, different culture, different religion, they just look completely different. And there's the sort of fear of the other, which then becomes compounded and on all sorts of different levels in economic competition, and frankly speaking, in the attempt to sort of label people as being unable to accept our democratic traditions.
Of course, that fear of the other translates directly, and I think the Chinese Exclusion Act is, I'm sure you'd agree, an example of racism in our society. So in your mind, Bob, has our embracing of immigration, our acceptance of however difficult it may have been, sort of a constant overcoming of racism in American society as well, as we, through these successive waves of people who are different, who are other, become ourselves a more tolerant society?
Well, I think we have, and the response to that is predicated on the numbers. If you look at the response to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the numbers of Chinese coming into the country in the late 19th century were not that large. We're talking about tens of thousands of people at the most. Now we're talking about 1 million people a year. So some of these themes that were prevalent 100 years ago, I was just remarking to a colleague today that if you look at Harper's Illustrated, these cartoons, and you paste over a Hispanic person over the Chinese caricature, then you've got the same argument today. But the thing that we're missing in that point is that we're talking about millions of people coming in instead of tens of thousands. And I think there's a concern about that in terms of just quantity.
I want to address that concern also, because that's an aspect of what we're talking about. But I want to relate it to something you said earlier, Bob, that I think is very important. You mentioned how powerful a phenomenon immigration is in this country. Is it the sense it's more powerful here than anywhere else in the world? It's that important to us. It's just it exceeds what goes on in other nations?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's been some recent scholarly writing on how people are immigrating, say, to Great Britain or Australia, relatively more so than they have been in the past, and those countries are sort of opening up to the immigrant experience. But the sheer numbers, there's just no difference.
Right.
And it's just not in the political culture and the political ideology of Great Britain and Australia as it has been for this country.
I think that's an excellent point. It is in our political ideology, and that's something I want to return to in the course of our conversation. Moving right along, Bob, on this question of the ongoing discussion about immigration, it's on the ongoing changes in it. There is also, I think, in our time, perhaps unlike earlier periods, a very marked discussion about legal versus illegal immigration. And I get the sense, without having the statistics at hand, that illegal immigration is more powerful a phenomenon at this point in our history than it previously has been. How does that affect the question or confuse it?
Well, I think it affects it a great deal because the numbers right now say that there are up to 11 million illegal immigrants in our country right now. And illegal, of course, is a construct, it's a definition. Part and parcel of the problem is if you look back at the 1965 Immigration Act, immigrants from the Western Hemisphere were limited for the first time to 120,000. So, whereas other countries had certain caps of 20,000 each, you're essentially saying that the country that has most economic ties to the United States and most interchange between the United States should have as many people coming in as the combined total of Denmark and 3 other Scandinavian states and the 3 Baltic states. Well, there are no illegal immigrants from the 3 Baltic states and the Scandinavian states. Well, maybe there are 7 or something like that, but there aren't that many. And so if our laws were in fact constructed in a certain way, then we would have in fact less illegal immigrants. I know that's sort of a simplistic thing to say, but that construct is there. The construct of a limit on people coming in from Mexico is in our law. So the rest of the people coming in are in fact illegal. there are good laws and bad laws, and I think a good starting point for any discussion, certainly given the divisiveness right now of the immigrant issue, is to talk about how our laws can best serve the community that's here.
And better reflect reality.
Yeah.
And better reflect reality.
Absolutely.
Who are these immigrants today, Bob? Who are our new immigrants? Where are they coming from? How have the numbers changed? The types of people and the places that they come from?
Well, they're no longer European, that's for certain. There's quite a large number of Hispanic people. I can give you the numbers for the Washington, D.C. metro area. They're pretty much 39% from Latin America, 36% from Asia, meaning anywhere from India and Pakistan to, say, Japan, China, Vietnam. 12% still come from Europe, and 11% come from Africa. And so that's the sort of mix, which I think is reflective, by and large, of what's going on in the rest of the country.
Well, that growth in the Washington area, I just looked at myself, and it's been nothing less than explosive. 54% of the foreign-born population arrived within the last decade.
Yeah.
So that's literally changed the face of this region, and I suspect many others as well. Are there, in fact, when we think of the places that have been dramatically changed by new influxes of immigrants, are we thinking now of different places? I mean, for example, the start of the 19th century, you talk New York, Cleveland, Chicago, Buffalo, et cetera. But now are the so-called gateways in different places?
They absolutely are. As a matter of fact, Cleveland and Buffalo are two of the cities that don't necessarily attract immigrants these days for various reasons. There are certain consistent gateways that have always been there. New York, of course, is one of them. Chicago is one. And people still come there. But the fact of the matter is that immigration is affecting our entire country. And we have, like Washington, which never had an immigrant tradition,
right.
apart from being a portal for slavery. But beyond that, there was no immigrant tradition here. All of a sudden, as you rightfully mentioned, over the past 20 years, we've become the 7th largest immigrant portal in the country.
This is the 7th largest
Yes,
immigrant portal in the country.
Yes,
I
it
didn't
is.
know that. I had heard North Carolina, Washington State,
Yeah.
Colorado even.
Yeah.
These are the new places.
Atlanta is a big new portal. Dallas is a big portal. Yes, in North Carolina, absolutely. And the fact of the matter is it's pretty much everywhere.
Right.
I read an interesting article in the Post I say it's about 2 years ago now, but it still stuck with me, about sort of dying communities or diminishing communities rather in Nebraska. Where the young people just don't want to live there anymore, and the town sort of dwindling, and is now becoming alive again in the influx of Hispanic community.
It's interesting. I've read the same kind of article about Somali and Ethiopian immigrants revitalizing northeastern New England towns that were also once thought to be dying. It's clear, Bob, from these numbers and the phenomena you're describing, that this is literally changing the face of America. I don't think that's an overstatement. And so my next question, Bob, is how is that changing the face of America? How is it influencing the kind of ongoing discussions or even arguments we tend to have? And let me try to be specific about that. One of the things I think you might agree with me that we've been noticing in America, the immigrant issue set aside, one of the things we've noticed as a discussion topic has been the whole question of, are we a melting pot, or is this a country of kind of distinct ethnic identities, political identity, I think it's called, that line of thought. How does the fact that we're having these vast numbers of very energetic people come into this society affecting that kind of discussion? Is it, in other words, are we going to be redefining what it means to be an American because of these new numbers from these very new places?
It's a good question to ask, George. I don't know if I can answer it or not. You know, I saw an article in the New York Times not too long ago that interviewed a bunch of Mexican laborers. I think these gentlemen were all illegal immigrants. And they said, you know, we're not leaving, because what we've got here, we came here for the money, but we realized that it's just much better here than what we came from. And we have, and this is the typical argument, typical discussion that all immigrants sort of, after a while, they sort of put on the table. My children will have it better here. My children will have a better life here than they would have had in Mexico, so we're not leaving. And I think what needs to be considered in this entire line of discussion, and I think that it's being left out of the discussion, is the strength of our political institutions.
Right.
And I think especially the more extreme views on both sides seem not to have too much faith in those fundamental political values that we have, to the point where we have some people questioning whether a Mexican can live in a country like ours and have the same understanding of freedom and liberty and justice, which seems to me to be a little silly, to be frank.
I agree with that, Bob, and let's focus on that, because I think that's, why would someone assume a Mexican couldn't come here and, be a fully participant American and accept the values of this country? That's really what you said. The strengths of these values and their institutions to speak for themselves, isn't that?
As far as I'm concerned, I think so. I think that when your country is prides on inclusion, on following the rule of law, and when we talk about illegal immigrants, we can come back to that and following the rule of law, but liberty and justice for all, these are tenets that this country stands on. It's the bedrock of our institutions. And frankly speaking, going back to the Harper's Weekly, I just saw a cartoon in there that said, "E pluribus unum, except the Chinese." And this is the sort of, no, it's e pluribus unum. That's what we're all about here. The fact of the matter is that people are willing to come here. In some cases, they're dying to come here. But they're coming here not just because they want to make an extra dime and go back. Maybe they are to start. But once they realize what it's like to be living here and what sort of opportunity is here and what they can do for themselves and their children, then that's what makes this country what it is. And I think that people lose sight of that. And if you want to create a cultural construct which is just predicated on certain small terms like Christian fundamentalism or Anglo-Saxon Protestant work ethic, then you can say, oh well, that's not part of the common. That's not part of the common culture. But that, of course, I'm not part of the common culture either.
Nor would I be, but that lessens the common culture.
Right. So if you want to start from there, as some people have, then maybe you have a problem. But it's my contention that the values of this country are so strong and so desirable that people who come here do in fact adopt them over time. And I think the statistical evidence shows that.
And that's very eloquent. And as I listen to you, Bob, and I'm very glad we got onto this, because it seems to me what we're talking about is a test of our own faith in our own institutions, our own values, and who we are and who we are constantly becoming. Yes. And isn't that and not to gild the lily, but isn't that really the sense of this country, that America is constantly in definition?
Well,
but through the acceptance of common values, but by ever differing peoples doing it.
Yeah. Well, it's the melting pot. So the answer to your question, your early question, it is the melting pot. It's people coming here, and what they speak as a language at home, and what they cook for dinner, and what they watch on TV, pretty much falls under the rubric of their business. But when they come out into the common
public square,
into the public sphere and square, they're Americans. And we do have to look at certain numbers that make this issue even more poignant, for the fact that, example, the Hispanic community in this country pumped $460 billion into the economy in 2000. According to the Virginia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, $460 billion into this country, $6 billion in Virginia alone.
Right.
Well, $6 billion in 2004, but generally $460 billion in 2000. That's an awful lot of money.
It's an awful lot of money. I guarantee you that's a fact that's very little known.
Yeah.
We've looked at this, Bob, very helpfully, thanks to you, from the point of view of our country receiving these waves of immigrants historically and in the contemporary sense. And as I said, you've been very eloquent on that. If we, and I know this is a matter of direct concern to you in your role as president of Liberty's Promise, if we look at it from the perspective of the new immigrants coming here, and I know you deal face to face with this in a very practical sense, what kinds of problems do they sense on their entry into this vast complexity we call America? I mean, I can imagine, getting a good job is obviously job one, but what else is it?
Well, it's a whole process of trying to fit in. And the real interesting point to all this is that we shy away from the word assimilation, because I guess that has some connotations as a bad word. But this is what people are trying to do. People are trying, in fact, to assimilate. into this country, and they're trying to become part and parcel of the fabric of society in their smaller communities so that they can live here successfully.
Right.
Whether they have a hard time with English, well, my grandfather had a hard time with English, but they're trying their best to fit in, and that causes a lot of problems and concerns that people have to deal with, especially if a family comes. If a family comes, all of a sudden the child's role within the family in a traditional family structure might even be inverted because it's the young boy or the young woman who's bringing the father and the mother to the DMV to get a driver's license because the parents can't speak English. They don't know what's going on.
As opposed to the traditional roles where they would have done that.
Right, right. So there's just the simple act of picking up what you know and leaving it, which everybody in this debate seems to not think about, I think, because that is in fact a very daunting endeavor to pick up everything that you have and to go somewhere else, and then to have to try and pick up the language as best you can, to try to support your family as best you can. So people moving here face those issues of trying to make sure that they raise their children right, as best as they know how.
I want to commend you, because I think that if nothing else from this conversation, if people would think about what it means to leave everything you know, pick up, as you point, from that, and then go to someplace entirely strange, quite powerful, in many ways overpowering, and build a new life. The act of courage involved, if nothing else, I think has been a source of strength for all of us. And with that editorializing, let me move ahead, Bob, in this conversation, because I think we are at the point where we should introduce your organization, because you brought it into being, I think, largely to talk about, to address, not just talk about, the kinds of things we are conversing about. And you did it, as I understand, Bob Ponichtera, you founded Liberty's Promise in the wake of September 11th, and your sense of it. And I'd like to get a very personal statement about how that affected you, why you did this, and what you're trying to do with it.
Well, again, I think it comes back to the belief in the core values of this country as I see them. And so I don't have the right answer and the license on what the core values are, but I really believe that liberty and individual liberty and freedom and democracy are what we're built on. And so in the direct aftermath of September 11th, there was one point in time where people were fretting about how the rest of the world hates us, and they're just sort of fed up with America. And I sort of thought about that and said, well, if that's so, why is it that millions of people are still beating down the door to come here? Some people, in some cases, they're dying to come here in order to have a better opportunity and a better life for themselves. And I thought that by far the best way to ensure that our political traditions remain intact and strong in the face of a changing demographic is to work with people coming here, and particularly young people who have the greatest chance of accepting our values and moving into them, than to create something like this.
And precisely how do you work with them? Just in the most direct sense, what does Liberty's Promise do for them?
We work with legal documented immigrants, ages 15 to 21, and we place them in internships, and we place them in everywhere in Northern Virginia, basically right now. We're hoping to move into Montgomery County as we speak. We place them in every place from a jeweler and a caterer in Alexandria to Congressman Jim Moran's office, who was very helpful in getting us funding, starting funding, to the office of the mayor in Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs, to Wegmans out in Fairfax, and we placed them. So we placed them in for-profit businesses and nonprofits, Freedom House, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, hopefully here at the Wilson Center pretty soon, and media outlets and government. And there's a minimum maximum gain for it. What we try to do is we try to make sure that on the minimum gain that young people get comfortable in a work environment, in an office environment. Put on a tie, go report to Mr. CA, he's going to tell you what to do. And sooner or later, the young person's milling around the office and working around the office and realizes, I can do this. Mr. CA told me to do this, and I can do it now, and it's so great. And at the end of the day, they get that experience out of their belt, so that they say, you know what, I can succeed here. I can do something. I've made connections, I've networked, and Mr. CA is going to write me a nice recommendation, and now I can go on and do something else. as a starting point. And the maximum gain is to get young people into the career where they want to be.
Right. I see this, Bob, as having immense practical utility for these young people, but also inspiring them to future roles in the society. I mean, and I guess the easy word for this, or the most economical word, is leadership roles that they might eventually be playing.
Absolutely, and what to focus on that, we also have a civics component of what we do. They just don't do internships. We put them we have them like in a class, which is the bad word for it, but we do have a structured environment where immigrants, successful immigrants from the community, someone who came from Salvador 20 years ago or 30 years ago, will come to the room and say, you know what? I was in the same boat you are. I didn't, I just came here with like $20 in my pocket, or that's when my parents came here, and now I own 5 restaurants in Falls Church, and I've got a nice house, and I did this, and you can do it. Mm-hmm. And then we take them off to Capitol Hill, and we take them to Arlington County government, and we take them to the fire station, the police station, and Arlington Independent Media, just to show them that this is where you live.
Right.
This is your community, and you need to be cognizant of that because you're part of it. And if you contribute to it, sooner or later you can better your community and better your whole, better your neighborhood and better your own lives.
Well, my direct and absolutely candid response to this, Bob, no attempt to flatter, is it's a marvelous thing to do. Because it seems to me the very nature of promise is to counteract despair and to give people a sense of being able to move ahead in the society.
Sure.
I commend you very much for what you do. Is there a website people can?
There is, www.libertiespromise.org. Come have a visit. It's a little dated right now, but we're fixing it up.
We'll be looking at it.
Thank you, George.
Thank you so much, Bob.
All right, appreciate it.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching.
Next week on Dialogue.
In the case of Iran, it is inside the treaty regime. It's not like India or Pakistan or Israel that did not sign. It's inside the treaty regime, and there are obligations with that. And this crux issue, again, is whether these civilian nuclear activities kind of cross the line.